Hi everybody, my name is Matthew Poes of Poes Acoustics, and in this video from Ted Manassa, he says, this was in response to my Create Your Dream Small Home Theater Room, and he says, enjoying the videos. Question, I'm curious about active systems to eliminate SBIR, that's Speaker Boundary Interference Response, improve imaging and potentially reclaim floor space by getting more efficient and smaller speakers on wall. Systems like the Grimani Rixos. Why or why not go active versus reference passive like Perlisten? What about blending an active front stage with a passive everything else? Thanks. All right, so this is a good question for a number of reasons. So first, let me just say, there's nothing in Grimani's Rixos speakers that would inherently, because they're active, get rid of the SBIR. It's because they're mounted on the wall. So an on-wall or an in-wall speaker isn't going to have the same kind of SBIR problems that a floor-standing speaker would have because of its position out in the room. You basically eliminate one of the most significant SBIR effects, which is the front wall, because you've pushed it up against that. But a passive speaker can do that. So the Perlisten, you said like reference speakers. So Perlisten's S series or R series in-walls also don't have SBIR problems. Actually, no in-wall does, from the front wall at least. Improve imaging. So active speakers can do some things that can improve imaging, arguably, but it would assume a couple of things. One is that the passive speakers have a problem with this, which they may not. And it also assumes that there aren't other ways to fix it, which there are. So an active speaker can use some phase linearization type filters, basically FIR filters, on the anechoic response to give it a completely flat phase response. So some people like to point out that that is only true at one point in space. That is true, but my experience has been that when you get it flat at one point in space, it's more flat at other points in space. So these FIR filters, which Genelec applies them, RBH uses them in their active series. Let's see, there's a number of, I'm forgetting the names of the companies now, but there's actually a whole bunch of pro audio companies that do these filters. They're really common in pro audio use. Partly because the DSP is already there. Like it already exists to do it, and it's an easy thing to implement. And so in my opinion, there's no reason not to. And I know a number of other people who have the same view, which is that it's not hugely audible, but it's not inaudible. It's a subtle effect, and it doesn't cost much of anything to do because you get the measurement you need to create that phase filter is one of the measurements you would get in the design phase anyway, which is an on-axis or a listening axis measurement of the speaker full band. You then take that, you essentially invert the phase response to make it flat using FIR filters. The neat thing is that if you did that in room, you would essentially overcompensate, but if you're doing it with an anechoic response, you're not. And so there isn't much limitation you need to do there. You can fully flatten that phase response out and there's no real issue with it. Now, some people don't like the sound of that. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying some people don't like the sound of a speaker that's had that done to it. It also can cause ringing. So pre-ringing of the filters is not an uncommon effect of FIR filters. And when the filters are long enough to give you a flat response over the full bandwidth of the speaker, you're more likely to have this pre-ringing. So some people claim that's audible and a worse effect than the phase. Other people disagree with that. I will say this, Trinnov has a pre-ringing like elimination filter that reduces pre-ringing on the filters because it can pre-ring a bit. And you can sometimes see these in the measurements, and I can't for the life of me hear a difference. And everybody I've talked to, even within Trinnov, a company, have said they can't hear a difference. So if pre-ringing is audible, I've never noticed it. And getting rid of it has never been audible. All right. Then, in terms of like the Grimani Rixos versus Perlisten, I think that Anthony makes a comment about this, and I think he's right. I think the problem is we still have some limitations that make active speakers not necessarily the full solution that we'd like them to be. An active speaker gives you so much more control over the design of a speaker that you can achieve optimized results that would be very difficult to achieve with a passive speaker. But that doesn't mean that in today's world, we can't get a passive speaker that measures every bit as good as the best active speakers within reason. So since the Rixos was being put up against the Perlisten, if you look at the measurements of the Perlisten speakers, they're extremely good. The on-axis and listening window response is extremely smooth. One of its greatest attributes is if you look at its directivity from the standpoint of the directivity index, the directivity index is one of the smoothest directivity indices of any speaker. It's smoother than the Rixos. Quite a bit so, for that matter. And the Rixos is no slouch. It's a very good speaker. So I would argue that you can get extremely good results from passive speakers. Now, Anthony speakers could be made passive and the results would still be very, very good. But like I said, you get a lot more control with active, and it lets you do things that, can be very difficult, if not impossible, to do passively, which can make the results that much better. And just because I want to make this clear, I don't know that everybody understands this with those speakers. Grimani's speakers dispersion is wider than pretty much any other speaker on the market of a normal design. There are some speakers from companies out there that have like intentionally omnidirectional radiation, or weird tricks have been used to create wider dispersion, but the results are also a very compromised speaker. They're not that wide. They're not like that. That's its own thing. But Anthony's speaker design, which came from Manny, actually, Manny's the designer of those, the engineer behind it. So Manny's speaker design that Anthony sells is much wider dispersion than a normal front radiating speaker. So whereas most speakers that might say that they're 120 degrees dispersion, what you'll notice is that you're still 6+ dB down, sometimes as much as more like 9 dB down, out at 120 degrees. It would be 60 degrees to either side. And even more so as you get out to 180. If you look at the Grimani speakers, they aren't down as much when you get out that far as a normal speaker. And in fact, they remain at almost the exact same level over a very wide window, horizontally, not vertically. And you don't want really wide vertically anyway. So what that means is that the speaker has a very wide dispersion pattern, such that if you look at something like the Spinorama, they all kind of sit on top of each other. So like the on-axis, the listening window, and the early reflection response are almost right on top of each other. That's really unusual. And that's because of the unusual nature of the design of the speaker. It's specifically that waveguide that they developed, which has the opposite effect of a normal waveguide. So instead of narrowing the dispersion, it actually expands the dispersion of the tweeter. And then if you use it with woofers would have wide dispersion within a certain range at least. If you use it within the wide dispersion range of the woofer and you optimize the integration, you get a speaker that has itself very wide dispersion. And in the case of Grimani's, they also have relatively low distortion and very, very high output for what they are. And that makes them a great speaker for theater use. They're also an excellent 2-channel speaker, and they have lots of dynamic range because of that. There are actually additional things. I feel like we actually need to get away from the Grimani speakers or the Perlisten speakers and think in more absolute terms. If you look at some of the interesting papers that have been put out by certain companies that develop software for this, one of them actually is Klippel, and another one would be PowerSoft, where they've developed techniques where the DSP can be used in a sort of active, if you read it, you would think it's a servo, but it's not a servo. But basically, the amplifier can be reading what the speaker is doing, and you can apply correction to it, and it gives you a little bit of extra output. You can reduce distortion in the speaker, and you can prevent the speaker from going into overload. And it's a much more graceful way than it would typically be possible. It's like a limiter, but it's a very advanced form of a limiter. It's not something that you could do with normal amplifiers and limiters. And so it leads to a speaker that has much higher, basically a better performance envelope, a wider one, and better performance in that envelope than you would typically get. So there's things you can do actively that can completely transform what speakers are doing. And I think that would be very interesting if we started to move towards that more in our home speakers. I'm going to guess it's cost and interest maybe that's keeping us from doing that. The other thing that's worth noting is that a lot of the advancements and advantages of active speakers can be applied to passive speakers through after-the-fact DSP. So you can take a passive speaker and you can do what some people would call intrinsic correction of its response. And as long as the crossover itself was a really good crossover design, it just didn't have enough. Crossovers have EQ in them too. You can use these trap filters to create the equivalent of PEQ. And it uses typically 2 to 3 parts, sometimes more, per filter band. So if a speaker needs 15, for instance, PEQs to get a really flat response, which is a lot, but that wouldn't be completely unheard of, then imagine building a passive crossover that has something like 40 or 50 parts added to the crossover just for that alone. Just to keep cost under control and size under control, you'd compromise the quality of those parts probably. And more than likely, you wouldn't use that many. You would just say, well, we're not going to do 15 correction filters. We're going to do 5 or something like that. So the neat thing with the DSP is you can apply those EQ filters after the fact if you want to. And so this intrinsic correction allows you to have all that same control, but still it's basically a passive design. It still only needs one amplifier channel per speaker, which is kind of nice. Now, the issue with the active speakers that I have, and why I'm not totally sold on active as of today, is that while you could, if you did it right, use a really good amplifier like a Purify or a Hypex, the typical amplifiers that are used for this are okay, but not great. They still are very noisy, and it means that these super high-end systems tend to have hiss. And they are super high-end in so many ways, but to me, super high-end should also include no audible hiss. And so to get rid of that noise, you have to use better amplifiers and better DSP that has better AD-DA converters, or however you're doing it. And the PowerSoft amps are good, but not great. I've been evaluating a Pascal DSP amp lately. It's good, it's not great. They just don't equal the performance capabilities of the best amplifiers on the market. I haven't measured all of them, but I'm yet to measure a DSP amplifier system that actually has the kind of noise and performance you can get out of the best equipment on the market. And so adding these into the chain tends to compromise performance. And so what you'd have to do to really make this good would be to make like a custom DSP amplifier using the good modules and then a good DSP. And it's not really that simple. I mean, one of the things you'd find if you've ever done this kind of engineering is the moment you throw all that stuff in one box, the performance degrades and it takes a lot of work to get it back. And I mean, to be honest, it doesn't fully come back ever. Maybe there's people out there that are, I mean, I'm not like a great electrical engineer or anything, but even the ones I've worked with seem to be incapable of 100% realizing the same results that the individual modules and chips are capable of once they're put into a full system. So once you try to take, and also remember, active speakers are going to need 2, 3, 4 times more amplifier channels than you would need otherwise. So in Anthony's top speakers, the most expensive, the RIX XL, that I believe needs 4 amplifier channels per speaker. So think about how expensive it gets if you're doing that with like Purify. I mean, those are great amplifiers, but they're very expensive on a per module basis. And so if you start to do something where you need 4 of those for the left, 4 of those for the center, 4 of those for the right, and then even with the other ones, if you only need 2, that's still twice as many as you needed before. Now you've got 12 channels in the front, amplifier channels. You've got, for a 9.1.6 system, you would have then, would that be 6 for the other channels? So the 6 speakers now have 12. So that's 24 amplifier channels just for that base layer. And then you've got 6 for the top. That's 20. That's 12 as well, sorry. So you've got the 12 for the top added on to the 24 that we had there. That's 36 amplifiers that you need. So, even if you could do it at $500 per channel, let's say, you'd be looking at $18,000 in amplifier modules. You then have the DSP portion of that. And again, now you need 36 plus channels of DSP for all this, and that isn't getting into the subwoofers. So getting 36 channels of DSP is quite expensive. So you'd be looking at like $25,000 basically in the amplifier DSP part. And I know you guys, because that's my reaction to it, even though I know what the costs actually are like. If I put out an active speaker system and I told you that the amplifier, and realistically, the numbers I just gave you don't really leave margin in there to make a profit, but let's just pretend I figured out some way to make margin. If I sold something that had like a $35,000 amplifier to power a 9.1.6 system, not including the subwoofers, so it's really just the 9 and the 6, and then the speakers were also what they would cost to produce, which would be quite a lot, you'd flip a lid, right? You'd think that's absolutely absurd and that I must be raking it in. But as I just said, actually, that didn't include a margin. That really, I mean, again, there are ways to make that include a small margin, but if you were to do typical margins, you'd end up having to increase that number by about 25 to 30% as a manufacturer. And that's just to cover your overhead, pay yourself something, cover your costs, have some money in reserve for warranty repairs, et cetera. And then you've got dealers. Dealers are going to want to make something off of that too. So that product becomes really, really expensive really quickly. So in case you've ever wondered why the very best Hypex or Purify amplifiers aren't being used in these really high channel count active systems, that's why. It just gets really, really expensive really quick. And the more channels you do, the more expensive that gets. So one of the nice things about passive speakers is the channel count is lower and you can get away with using these really good amplifiers. All right. Spend enough time talking about that. Thanks again, everybody, for watching my channel. Thank you for all the contributions you make. The financial ones are really helpful and help me to do these videos more often. Thank you for all the feedback. Like, keep it up, keep talking, keep writing. I may not write back. I got a lot going on right now with the hurricane and everything, but I'll do my best. Keep asking these great questions. I think that people are finding this really enjoyable and helpful, and that's good. So I thank everybody for everything that they're doing with that and all the help to help grow the channel. The channel's at 5,000 plus people now, which is great. So make sure you like these videos, subscribe to my channel. Let's keep that going. And again, those donations are helpful. We're kind of asking everybody to make a donation if they're going to ask questions for me to answer, just because I'm getting so many I can't keep up. And that helps to justify that. All right. Well, thank you very much again. I got more videos coming.